Rise of Nations is a perfect game, said no one ever. Except if you've been living under a rock or in a basement, which doesn't really narrow down any percent of their own player base, so ignore what I just said. The point I'm getting at is that Rise of Nations has a lot of things that can be improved on. Don't get me wrong, I like Rise of Nations. I just want to see it be the best version of itself. Right now, it's kind of like staying with an abusive wife. There's no one else you can talk to, and there's no other girls to choose from. Hopefully, World of Revolution will change all that. For now, all we can do is figure out for ourselves what is wrong with the game. Like how the game loop is very repetitive for every single game. Just invade, build tanks, invade, auto-capture, annex, build more tanks, and so on. There's no individuality or uniqueness to all the different nations in the game. For example, the only difference between the countries of Europe and Africa is maybe one development tier, terrain, and a different flag. Of course, there's also the formables, but I wouldn't really consider them unique to the game since formables themselves aren't that different from one another in how they work. They all just give cores to the land needed for the formables and you just gain stability. That's about it. Maybe if the 6th Empire gets added, they can change my views, but for now, I'm gonna remain on my stance that they all are the same. So I thought it would be a good idea to just make a video organizing my thoughts about the game, so I can understand why I think the game is very repetitive sometimes. Because, I mean, it kinda is. But I will also make some suggestions and ideas to help Hyperant afford his life support. Let the guide begin. Oh wait, wrong script. The core of Rise of Nations is in its combat. I mean, it's literally a war game focused on world domination. As stated in the description, every single action you do in the game is to make your army stronger. Bigger economy, more resources to build and craft stuff, research, better technology that improves your unit's combat ability, and so on. There's not really much depth to everything, but I will get to that point later on. The problem I'm gonna focus on right now is that despite all of this, the combat is super, and I mean super stale, plus it's very unbalanced. Let's start off with the staleness. And in my humble opinion, I think that everything about the game that seems repetitive stems from the goddamn auto-capture button. It makes it feel more like watching a simulation rather than you, the player, affecting the changes and outcomes during the wars. Of course, it would be impossible to manage hundreds of unit stacks in real time. I get that. What I don't get is why there are no more other options of auto-capturing. Let's say for example I want my units to only auto-capture cities with valuable resources like tungsten or titanium. Well fuck you, there's literally no option for that in the game. The same is for other special things you want to auto-capture like square cities or cities that have factories, which would help you at least organize your units into different groups with a different set of goals. Heck, add battle plans like in Hoi 4. I don't know, just fix the goddamn auto-capturing. But I can live without that if there's something else that can affect the ground combat in any meaningful way. So is there anything? Well yes, there is the infamous scorching that gives attrition, but it's more so used as a means of toxicity by burning your entire country to the ground when you are losing in a war, rather than giving attrition to big enemy troop stacks, which is my main complaint about the combat system. I think that the way the units engage in combat and moves around needs to be heavily improved, but it isn't as a big offender as stacking. The game doesn't necessarily need a supply system like Hearts of Iron 4, but it at least needs a system to regulate way too big unit stacks. Like how the hell does it make any logical sense for 6 million troops to be able to supply enough food in a city with 5,000 population inside enemy territory? Having a supply system in Rise of Nations would be painful, since everything happens too fast. But having a system that gives attrition to unit stacks that exceeds a certain threshold, depending on the surrounding cities, should definitely be added. Having a punishing threshold limit will certainly be unfun, but having no limit will mean stupid tactics that would never work in any other strategy game, but it works here. If the recent leaks are to be believed, Hyperant is gonna be adding formations into the next update. Great! The problem is, it just keeps adding stuff without balancing stuff that heavily needs it. It's only a matter of time before Hyperant adds something that will completely ruin any game it is used on. Oh wait, that already exists. Hyperant forgot the fact that people are kinda stupid and just stack all their troops. You can just punch all your troops in one single point, and since there is no supply or attrition for having way too many troops in one stack, they can just kill one stack and then proceed to form a line behind the enemy formation and completely ignore their entrenchment bonuses, which makes the formations pretty useless. And don't get me started on the naval combat, the most flawed and the most unbalanced shit show. One aircraft carrier can literally defeat and wipe out the entirety of the United Kingdom single-handedly. Naval units should not be allowed to damage ground units. It's very dumb. Same with artillery. It should not damage naval units, maybe only just a little bit. But Amandus, I hear you say, just attack the aircraft carrier with your navy stack. You will surely wipe it out. Well, look here, you little shoehorn. The aircraft carrier is, as you guessed, it is also in a naval stack. And at that point, there's no single point to break through or tactics. It's just a numbers game where you have to face it head on. When you face something head on, it literally just becomes math where the large numbers win. Stacking is a fundamental problem with having way too big 3D models like the game does, which removes any forms of strategy. So the only way I can see it being fixed is forcing a system down the throat where you can only have a certain amount of units in one spot. And then there's also the problem with the war system. When you go to war, there should be a certain war score to determine and see how close you are to winning. Winning battles that decimate your opponent's army should give war score, and when the war score reaches 100%, you can fully annex the other country, so you don't have to wait until you are occupying 90% of an entire country, like Russia, which is hell on earth. And adding a system where the AI will always accept demands on cities you are occupying would be a very nice quality of life update, since we then don't have to invade all of Russia again for freaking Kaliningrad, which is 3 cities. And one more thing that needs to be improved is giving more uses to military power, like making them be able to affect certain battles or sieges. You can, for example, spend military power to reduce the time it takes to take down a city in exchange for more losses, which would massively help if you're in a hurry. Or you can spend points on defending more or doing more damage. A lot of things that can be explored. So I'm not saying to incorporate everything all of the games are doing, but what I am saying is that it's very fun to read people rage in the chat. So giving more skill-based things would remove all their excuses and let me shit on them more. Please let me do that, Hyperant. But enough about combat. It's time we talk about the sexy topic of economy. Okay, maybe not so interesting for the majority of people, but it's still a very big part of the game. So why the fuck is it almost completely irrelevant? You sell consumer goods or electronics at the beginning of the game, and maybe change your tax law or policy, and that's about it. You never have to worry about your economy again. The main reason I see is that your income can only be affected in a few ways, and money is just way too abundant in the game. If someone is always doing the consumer goods strat, then theoretically, they should not go into debt if they spam tanks with all their manpower. This applies to all nations, and that's not even mentioning that you can just casually steal 75 million from each AI nation by just taking their treasury. Like, why? And that is, in my opinion, a very flawed game design when taking into account everything else in the game. Everything in the menu is built to be utilized later in the game, like research taking way too long to progress for it to be actually useful early game, same with political power and military. So why is everything else about the game built around speed? Being the first to build factories and sell stuff, being the first to get tanks, and justifications barely taken any time at all. And then we also get starting points in every category, which needs to be used early game, otherwise you lose your advantage, like research, which most people use for factory output too. When the majority of your army consists of tanks, then something is definitely not right. In my opinion, every problem about the economy stems from the damn trading. You can just simply buy enough resources from other nations, and since there are no trade routes or anything similar, you can't block certain nations from getting resources, and somehow Mongolia here can buy stuff from Antarctica even though China is occupying its entire nation. Iprand made a good decision by reducing the selling of electronics, but it just simply wasn't enough. You can just sell other stuff, like consumer goods. So the simple solution would be to remove the selling of resources to AI nations entirely, except subjects. Of course, that would nerf smaller nations a lot more than bigger ones, but superpowers needs to be heavily restricted in who they can attack. A way to balance everything out and give more options for people wanting to play tall, as an example, is adding trade routes. It doesn't necessarily have to be way too complicated, it's simply enough to just draw a few lines between different trade routes, and when you go to a war with a nation, they can just block the trade route with their troops, or an embargo option in the diplomacy tab, giving more uses to that. This would add a lot more strategy, while also not being way too complex, because we really need a system to starve some people out. And while we're at it, we can also add a certain amount of monuments to starting cities, similar to EU4 that gives bonuses to your nation, like Paris having the Eiffel Tower, which reduces the amount of attrition your army takes, or owning Moscow/St. Petersburg that increases factory output, as an example. This would influence players on which nations they will attack, and they will prioritize different ones, And this also gives the nations a uniqueness to their gameplay. Because if Russia gets more factory output, well, then they can just build more factories. And if Germany gets more tank ability, then they will just spam more tanks. Or if France gets better retrenchment bonuses, then they just spam more defenses. Such things. But it should also not be way too much. It's just simply enough to give a like 10% bonus. Don't give like 50%, that's crazy. And Hyperant, if you're going to add this, don't give the option to delete monuments. That would be the stupidest decision ever. Some of you might say that having complete freedom is why you play Rise of Nations, and by restricting it, you remove the fun. I disagree. Having complete freedom is a disaster, because it usually ends up with the server going into anarchy or one person dominating the entire game. We don't want that. Sure, it's fun for that one player, but for the rest, not so much. By restricting the freedom, we even the playing field, letting a new casual audience in, while also enticing hardcore players. They can still dominate, but it just takes time, and it's not just a mindless, oh, he has population, attack him. Now you have to actually focus on who to attack, and what you gain from attacking, which is what we want. Finally, the political, diplomatic, and research aspect of the game. The most unutilized part of the game. Think about it. Have you ever just started a game, spent all your research points on increasing your research speed, only to then leave without actually using those research points on something that actually affects your gameplay, like your tax income, simply because you didn't have enough time? Yeah, it's not really great. It's okay at best. It's just way too slow in my opinion. It only really shows its effects hours in the game, which should not be a good thing. A way to fix it would just to simply increase the amount of research points you earn, or options to increase your research points, like adding new buildings or events similar to the national monument, but in research, and it's also permanent, so not like the brilliant research we already have. Then there's also the problem that some people would just focus heavily on one route, and an annoying meta will develop, which is not something you want, because then there's only one way to play, and that becomes repetitive really quickly. So adding limits to research, similar to Hoi 4, where researching something too high too fast will cost extra, is something that is needed. Then there's also the problem with diplomacy, which needs to be fixed. Letting players have complete freedom over their alliances incentivizes cool and unique games. The only problem is that players are fucking stupid, like I mentioned before. Having complete freedom is not very nice. They just ally whoever sends a request, which often leads to players not being able to invade any other player, like at all, because everyone is allied to each other, then you can only invade AI nations. And we have established that is really fucking boring. So my suggestion would to be add a limit to the amount of alliances you can have, or faction members, because that is something that would help this massive problem and actually make you strategize on who to ally, rather than just allying everyone for the sake of it. Like, why would USA ally Fiji? There should also be more options that affects your game, similar to policies we currently have, or just make it so that political power isn't needed for policies, or you can just change ideologies in general. Because the problem right now is that you can really only have one of either ideology or policy. You can't use both early game, which seems like a missed opportunity for people to have different strategies. If we can use both, then people can differ with different sets of ideas and things, like one person using improved infrastructure and another one using military act. If we're going for the national idea thing, again, it doesn't have to be complicated. Just add like an option to pick a national focus every year or so that increases a certain thing. Like for example, every year you can pick between increasing factory output by 10%, ground unit strength by 10%, or naval strength by 10%, etc. Unlike research where everything stays permanent, having something that can be adjusted without consequences depending on what you're doing would help players actually think and plan ahead for when they are ready to switch to a more combat-revised strategy, for example. And lastly, the political aspect of the game, a thing that again needs to be improved a lot. There's a pattern here. There's no incentive to play for the long game. Why should I switch to fascism when I can just get neutrality act at the beginning of the game? Why wait 30 minutes for a thing that I will only spend 50 minutes using? Instead of locking certain ideologies behind bars that needs to be unlocked later on, add so they are all available at the beginning of the game. Add a fucking circle or a square that shows which ideology your country is supporting. Let me explain. At the start, it's 100%, depending on which you picked, and then it can be influenced by other surrounding nations. They can, for example, spend political power, which gives political power more uses, to sway your public opinion into a different ideology. And countries with the same ideology attacking each other gets a debuff. and countries with different ideologies will get a debuff when allying each other. Instead of having them give different bonuses similar to policies, have them actually affect how you make decisions and play. Right now it feels more like a level system, instead of having them actually change how you play the game. So for example, you can give different events to different ideologies, like giving a factory increase boost for communism, and some events increasing your ideological enemy, like a democracy getting an event that makes its public 10% fascist because you chose to oppress them in a worker strike. And then there should also be different systems for each ideology. Communism and fascism being pretty similar to the current base game, but they have a lot more freedom on what to do. Being able to forcibly train generals in the leader tab, fascism having the ability to do things similar to research spending and government spending we have right now, but instead it decreases military upkeep, increases combatability, and decreases training time and so on. While communism has the same things, but its decisions focuses on more on economy and numbers, like decreasing time to recruit troops, increasing factory output, and so on. Democracy and liberalism can have super different systems to both of those, having a parliament system. You can also give superpowers at the start of the game, similar systems to parliament that will heavily restrict decisions they make early game, because it's always annoying when a China player decides to just attack everyone, so make them pretty passive in the early game, at least. Then we also have the problem of formables. Holy fucking shit, why are there so many things that exists in Rise of Nations just for the sake of it? But there's actually no incentive to actually do it. I get it. You form things because it's cool and a nice flex, but not everyone has a completionist mindset, which will inevitably alienate a certain part of the player base. Right now, you only form things because of these reasons. It gives scores, and it increases your completion rates, and it's cool. But what if you actually made some game changes and give more rewards for forming certain nations? Instead of just giving that goddamn stability, giving more individuality, which I will touch on later on, would be a perfect thing to end this loop of repetitive gameplay. Like having formables that are historical kingdoms give the monarchy ideology, with a leader with different bonuses. Or having someone form Genoa or Venice, which gives the republic ideology, focusing on the money aspect and being able to recruit mercenaries, since their own army is weak. There's just so many things that can be improved on, and I just can't do everything justice in this small video of mine. All the things I suggested is already in the game, in some way with a few exceptions, but I still got one thing left to explore, which is the most important part, that increases replayability, and that is individuality and uniqueness. But I will just say individuality because it sounds cool. What makes Germany unique from Nigeria? As an example, adding unique focus tree to the main nations, similar to Hoi 4 or other Paradox games, would make you think twice before picking a nation. There's so many nations in the game, but everything is most often not centered around East Asia or Europe, because they have cool historical value. Why not add gameplay value to other regions to balance this out? Like adding a unique mission tree to each nation. I imagine something similar to the research tree we have right now, but everything is unique to the specific individual country. You can also add meme trees to smaller nations, make it very juicy and fun, like giving Cook Islands the ability to scorch and reduce a city's population by 50% later in their tree. So give the more less used regions like Africa full mission trees that increases the bonuses and makes them fun to play, and add some cool non-historical empires too to juice it up. But at the end of the day, this is just my opinion, I am just one guy. But you are not one guy, there's still a lot more that you can discuss in my Discord server. That's right, this entire video was an advertisement for my Discord server. It really needs to be revived because it's kinda dead. You can discuss things you want to improve with Rise of Nations in general chat or on my drone chat. Ooh, exciting! I will also no longer be hosting events on live streams, instead I will organize them on my Discord server. And if you want to become an event organizer, just message me. You can also ask me questions about Rise of Nations in the server, and I will help you to the best of my ability when I am available. Join my Discord server.